The year was 1887, and the town of Gray Butte was made of dust, wind, and ambition. The wind was the first thing you noticed. It never seemed to stop. A constant pressure from the west that scoured the paint from the raw timber buildings and pushed a fine red dust into every crack and seam of a person's life. It settled in the lines around your eyes, coated the back of your throat, and gave the water in the barrel a gritty taste. Days were a blaze of sun that bleached the very color from the sky, and nights were a sudden, clear cold that made the stars look like chips of ice. Gray Butte was not a town born of gentle settlement. It had been willed into existence by the railroad, a black iron spine laid across the prairie. Now the town clung to it, a cluster of buildings hoping to draw life from the beast that thundered past twice a day. There was a church, its unpainted wood already silvering in the sun, a saloon that was always louder, and a sprawl of stockyards that smelled of cattle and fear. The law office and the post office were the same small room, a place where a man could mail a letter, file a claim, or see his hopes officially recorded and stamped in ink. May O'Rourke knew about dust. At 24 years old, she felt like she had been trying to scrub the dust of her family's reputation from her skin her whole life. She was a blacksmith's widow, a fact that should have earned her a measure of quiet respect. But May was built on a larger scale than the women of Gray Butte were accustomed to seeing. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that were strong and capable from a life of hard work. She could have to sack a flower without a grunt, birth a calf in a cold spring rain, and turn a patch of stubborn dirt into a thriving garden. Her health was a solid, undeniable fact, a deep well of strength inside her. Yet, this very substance, the physical space she occupied in the world, was the source of her deepest unease. She walked with her shoulders slightly turned, a subconscious effort to seem smaller, and she feared the whispers of strangers more than she feared drought or winter. Her goal was simple and fierce. She wanted honest work. She wanted a roof over her head that was her own, a place where the only judgments came from her own conscience. She was running from the tangled legacy of her family, a name associated with more trouble than triumph. In her worn satchel, wrapped in a clean cloth, was her only weapon against the world's opinion, a letter of introduction from the Mother Superior of a convent where she had once sought refuge. The paper was thin, the ink elegant, and to May, it felt heavier and more valuable than gold. It was a testament to her character, a single voice speaking in her favor against a chorus of imagined whispers. Miles away, on a stretch of land called Coyote Bend, Eli Cutter was not thinking about whispers. He rarely thought about things that could not be fixed with his hands. At 32, he was the owner of the ranch, a widower, and a father. Words were a resource he used sparingly, preferring the clean logic of a well-mended fence or a straight furrow. He had 2 daughters, June and Josie, who were 5 years old and moved through the world like a pair of bright, curious birds. They were his whole world, the reason he worked from before the sun rose until long after it set. There was a silence in Eli that had not been there a year ago. His wife, Ellen, had been taken by a fever in the dead of winter, a swift and brutal illness that had left a wound in him so deep he did not know how to speak of it. Her absence was a physical presence in the small ranch house, a quiet ache in the evenings when the girls were asleep. He worked to fill the emptiness, piling his days so full of labor that there was no room for memory to take hold and overwhelm him. But in the quiet moments, it was always there, a shadow he could not outrun. The shadow that hung over Gray Butte had a name, Silas Burke. He owned the slaughterhouse, which gave him a hold on every rancher for 100 miles. He was also the town's primary moneylender, a position he used to weave a web of obligation and control around its citizens. He sat on the town council and spoke often and loudly about the importance of maintaining decency and order, usually while calculating the interest on a desperate man's loan. His piety was a tool, sharp and effective, and he used it to carve the town into a shape that suited his own interests. He saw newcomers not as neighbors but as assets or liabilities, to be measured against his own rigid standards. A nervous energy pulsed through the town, The cattle drive season was near, a time of hard work and potential profit that set the rhythm for the entire year. But the talk this season was edged with fear. The prairie grass was tinder dry. There had been no significant rain for months, and rumors of a coming drought were on everyone's lips. Men watched the horizon for the telltale signs of a storm, but they prayed it would bring rain, not the dry lightning that could turn the entire landscape into a sea of fire. This tension found its focus in the Ladies' Aid Society of the church. With the railroad bringing a steady stream of people through, they had taken it upon themselves to act as matchmakers. They compiled lists of eligible bachelors and kept a keen watch on the unattached women who stepped off the train, especially the ones who had come in response to advertisements for wives. These railroad brides were scrutinized. Their appearance, their posture, their very way of breathing weighed on a scale of modesty and propriety. For a woman arriving alone, Gray Butte was not a refuge. It was a trial. Eli Cutter had no time for such things, but he paid attention to the land and the sky. One afternoon, he rode into town, his wagon loaded with empty barrels. He bypassed the general store and went straight to the telegraph office. The operator, a young man named Samuel with ink stains on his fingers, looked up as he entered. Samuel told him the lines were acting strange. There was a humming on the wire that was not normal, a kind of electrical agitation he had never heard before. He had received a bulletin from 3 stations to the west, a warning of an unusual weather pattern. A line of storms forming that were producing more lightning than rain. A bad sign, he said, tapping a pencil on his desk. A very bad sign. Eli listened, his expression unchanging. He nodded once, a gesture of understanding that was more eloquent than a dozen words. He was not a man to panic, but he was a man who prepared. From the telegraph office, he went to the mercantile. He did not buy flour or coffee. He bought 3 large spools of the new barbed wire. It was a wicked-looking thing, a strand of metal with sharp points twisted into it every few inches. Some men hated it, said it was unnatural and cruel to the cattle. Eli saw it as a tool, a way to create order, to impose a line on a chaotic world. Back at Coyote Bend, he spent the rest of the day and the next reinforcing the corrals. He and his one hired hand, a man named Pete, set new posts, sinking them deep into the hard, dry earth. They stretched the barbed wire tight, the metal groaning with the tension. The sharp barbs glinted in the harsh sunlight. June and Josie watched from the porch, their small faces serious. They knew this was important work. Their father's focused silence told them so. As Eli worked, twisting the wire into place, his thoughts were not on the town or its gossip. He thought of the dry grass, the strange hum on the telegraph wire, and the 2 small lives that depended on him completely. He thought of the coming season and the thin line between survival and ruin. He was securing his world, one sharp point at a time, unaware that a woman whose entire life felt like an open wound was on a train, moving steadily toward Gray Butte, carrying a letter that was her only shield. The town was waiting, ready to pass its judgment, and the sky was waiting, holding its breath before the storm. The train ride from Cheyenne was a symphony of jolts and clatter. Each sway of the car a reminder to May O'Rourke that she was moving farther from a past she wanted to forget and closer to a future she could not yet see. She had bought the cheapest ticket available, which landed her in a car crowded with sunburnt men smelling of sweat and tobacco, and a small, nervous flock of women who were spoken of in whispers as the railroad brides. They were a collection of hopeful, anxious faces, all heading toward arranged futures with men they knew only from letters. They sat huddled together, sharing small confidences and sizing each other up, their conversations a low hum beneath the train's rhythm. May sat apart, near a dusty window, her large frame making the wooden bench feel small. She was an island in their sea of matrimonial chatter. The whispers found her soon enough. They were not meant to be loud, but in the close confines of the car, sound carried. "Look at the size of her," one thin woman with a pinched face murmured to her companion, her fan fluttering like a trapped moth. "A widow, they say." "A blacksmith's widow," the other replied, her voice laced with a kind of pity that felt sharper than scorn. "I suppose a man in that line of work would need a strong back. Still, it is a bit much." May did not turn. She kept her gaze fixed on the endless prairie rolling past the window, a blur of brown and pale green under a vast, empty sky. She had heard variations of these words her entire life. They were stones thrown by strangers, and she had learned long ago that the only way to not get hurt was to build a wall inside herself so high they could not reach her. She focused on the weight of her canvas satchel on her lap, on the crisp edges of the letter from the Mother Superior tucked safely inside. That was what mattered. A promise of work as a cook at the Gray Butte boarding house, a chance to be judged by her skills, not her size. She just had to get to the post office, where a final confirmation from the owner was supposed to be waiting. That was the only thought she allowed herself to hold. The train's whistle shrieked, a long, mournful sound that signaled their approach. As Gray Butte came into view, it was less a town than a scar on the landscape, a collection of raw timber buildings clinging to the iron tracks. The train hissed and groaned to a stop, and the platform outside erupted into a chaos of noise and movement. Eli Cutter was there, a solid, quiet presence amidst the bustle. He stood with his twin daughters, June and Josie, holding each by the hand. They were there to pick up a special order of milled fence posts, a heavy expense he hoped would secure his north pasture before the cattle drive. The girls were a whirlwind of excitement, their eyes wide at the sight of the massive steam engine. "Is it a dragon?" Daddy Josie asked, her small hand tight in his. "Just a machine, honey," Eli said, his gaze scanning the freight cars. He happened to be standing near a cluster of the town's more prominent women, members of the Ladies' Aid Society, who had come to inspect the new arrivals. Their voices were a constant, critical current in the town's air. May was one of the last to step down from the passenger car. She clutched her satchel and took a deep breath of the dusty air, trying to steady herself. The platform was a gantlet of staring eyes. She saw the women from the train being greeted by nervous-looking men, their futures beginning in an awkward handshake. May's business was with the post office, and she started toward it, keeping her eyes down. It happened in an instant. A baggage handler, struggling with a large, poorly tied crate of fence posts on a trolley, lost his grip. The crate, heavy and immense, tipped. The rope holding it snapped, and it slid off the trolley, momentum carrying it directly toward the spot where Josie Cutter stood. Momentarily mesmerized by a stray dog, a woman screamed. Eli lunged, but he was a step too slow. May was closer. She did not think. She acted. She dropped her satchel and moved with a speed that defied her size. In 2 long strides, she was there. She shoved the little girl with one arm, sending her tumbling safely out of the way, and turned her own body to shield her. The corner of the heavy wooden crate slammed into May's hip. The impact was a solid, sickening thud that stole her breath and sent a blaze of fire down her leg. She staggered but did not fall. Her hand braced against the station wall. Her teeth clenched against the pain. The world, which had seemed to stop, rushed back in. The baggage handler was stammering apologies. Eli was on his knees, his hands checking over a startled but unharmed Josie. He looked up, his eyes meeting May's for the first time. For a moment, he saw nothing but the instinctive, fierce protection in her posture. He saw a blur of brown skirts, a solidness that had moved with surprising grace. And then he saw his daughter, safe, looking up at the woman who had shielded her. The crowd, however, saw something different. Their initial shock gave way to commentary. The whispers from the train car had found a larger audience. "My word, did you see that one of the church ladies said," her voice carrying clearly, "she is as strong as an ox." A man standing nearby chuckled. "Too big to get a husband, I reckon, but useful in a pinch." The comment hung in the air, cruel and sharp. May felt her face burn with a familiar shame. She straightened up slowly, ignoring the throbbing in her hip. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears or her anger. She fixed her gaze on a point just beyond their heads, her expression a mask of stony indifference. Her dignity was in her silence. Just then, a stout woman in a starched apron bustled through the crowd. Her eyes, small and critical, took in the scene the fallen crate, the crying child being comforted by her father, and May, standing alone, the focus of the town's derision. "Miss O'Rourke?" the woman asked, her tone already disapproving. May turned, a flicker of hope trying to push through the pain. "Mrs. Gable, I came about the cook position." "Mrs." Gable's lips thinned into a straight line. She had seen enough. She had heard the comments. This large, conspicuous woman causing a scene the moment she arrived was not the sort of person she wanted in her respectable boarding house. "The position has been filled," she said, the lie as crisp and starched as her apron. "We cannot have someone who might frighten the guests." The words were a physical blow. Landing with more force than the crate had, the job, her one hope, was gone. Snatched away by a first impression she had no control over. The letter in her satchel suddenly felt as flimsy as a dead leaf. One of the church ladies, a woman named Beatrice, stepped forward and placed a proprietary hand on Eli Cutter's arm. "You see, Mr. Cutter," she said in a low, conspiratorial voice, "this is why one must be careful. You should not let your sweet girls get too close to such peculiar strangers." Eli gently removed her hand from his arm. He settled Josie on her feet and took June's hand again. He did not look at Beatrice. He did not look at the gossiping crowd. He walked the few steps to where May stood, her world collapsing around her in silent humiliation. He stopped in front of her. His face was unreadable, weathered by sun and worry, but his eyes were clear and direct. He did not offer pity or praise. He did not defend her or condemn her critics. He simply asked, "Are you hurt, ma'am?" The question was so ordinary, so fundamentally decent, that it broke through her defenses. He was not looking at her size. He was looking at her, a person who might be in pain. For the first time all day, she felt seen. A knot of tension deep inside her chest, a knot she had been carrying for years, loosened just a fraction. She found her voice, though it was rough. "I am fine. The child is all that matters." He nodded once, accepting her answer. Then, without another word, he turned and led his daughters away toward the freight master's office to sort out the matter of his fence posts, leaving May alone on the platform. The crowd, deprived of its drama, began to disperse, their whispers trailing off into the general noise of the station. That evening, the cold of the high prairie descended quickly. May had nowhere to go. The boarding house had rejected her, and she did not have the money for a room at the hotel, even if they would have had her. She found her way to the small building that served as the post office and law office. The postmaster, a weary old man named Henderson, was locking up. Seeing the desperation in her face, and perhaps feeling a sliver of pity, he offered her a place out of the wind. He did not offer her a bed, but he pointed to the small storage room in the back, filled with mail sacks and boxes. "You can stay the night here, but you must be gone before I open in the morning." May thanked him, her voice barely a whisper. She slipped into the dark, cramped space. It smelled of canvas, ink, and the dry dust of distant places. She sank down onto a pile of coarse mail bags, her hip aching with a deep, pulsing pain. She pulled her worn shawl tightly around her shoulders and drew her satchel onto her lap. In the darkness, her fingers found the letter from the Mother Superior. She pulled it out and held the thin paper in her hands. Its promise now a bitter irony. It was all she had left, a small, fragile symbol of a hope that had been crushed the moment her feet touched the soil of Gray Butte. She held it to her chest, a silent prayer against the vast, indifferent darkness that surrounded her. Sunday morning in Gray Butte arrived with a deceptive clemency. The wind had eased to a whisper, and the sun cast long, gentle shadows across the main street. It was the one day of the week the town put on its best face. Families in stiffly pressed clothes walked toward the church, the sound of its bell a thin, hopeful chime in the vast emptiness of the prairie. After the service, the area in front of the mercantile and the saloon became an informal town square, a place for trading news and judgment. May had been awake since the first gray light, her body stiff from the lumpy mail sacks, her hip a dull, persistent ache. She had smoothed her dress as best she could and tidied her hair, her reflection a fleeting ghost in the post office's grimy window. She waited until the postmaster, Mr. Henderson, arrived, then stepped out of the storage room, her pride a heavy cloak. "I would like to post a notice," she said, her voice steady. She held out a small piece of paper on which she had neatly written her qualifications: experienced cook, skilled in housekeeping, gardening, and animal husbandry, seeks honest employment, references available. Mr. Henderson took the paper but did not look at it. He looked at May, his eyes clouded with the second-hand opinions of others. He had heard the story from the station platform, embellished with each telling. "I am not sure that would be appropriate," he said, clearing his throat. "This is a town that values a certain conformity. Miss O'Rourke, your notice, well, it might not attract the kind of attention you are looking for." "I am looking for work, Mr. Henderson," May said, her patience fraying. "That is all." "Yes, well," he said, sliding the paper back across the counter as if it were contaminated. "The community has certain standards. We cannot just have anyone placing notices. It is not a good fit." The finality in his tone was another locked door. Not a good fit. The phrase echoed the boarding house owner's rejection. She was being erased from the town's possibilities before she had even had a chance to exist within them. Defeated. She took her useless piece of paper and stepped back out into the bright, uncaring sunlight. The street was crowded. A spectacle was underway. The railroad brides were being presented, one by one, to the town's eligible bachelors. Under the watchful eyes of the Ladies' Aid Society, they demonstrated their domestic skills. One woman displayed a finely stitched sampler, another a jar of perfect preserves. It was a market, and they were the goods. May turned away from the sight, the humiliation of it all a bitter taste in her mouth. She stood alone near the water trough, a large, solitary figure on the edge of the town's life, wondering what her next move could possibly be. She did not see the two small figures darting through the forest of adult legs, but she felt them. Two small bodies collided with her, one on each side, their arms wrapping tightly around her thighs. She looked down, startled, into the identical, upturned faces of June and Josie Cutter. "It is you," June cried out, her voice filled with the pure, uncomplicated delight of a child. The angel lady, Josie added, hugging May's legs so hard she nearly overbalanced. "You saved me from the box dragon." Their father was not far behind. "Girls!" Eli Cutter's voice was firm but not angry. He moved through the crowd, his path clearing a little as people stepped aside to watch. The town had gone quiet. The showcasing of the brides had been forgotten. Here was a new, more interesting drama. Eli reached the small group, his expression unreadable. His gaze flickered from his daughter's beaming faces to May, standing stiff and mortified by the sudden attention. The entire town was watching. And then the moment came, a sound so clear and piercing it seemed to cut through all the layers of gossip and prejudice. It was Josie, looking back at her father, her small face earnest and certain, who shouted the words that would change everything. "She's fat but an angel, Daddy." The declaration, in a 5-year-old's high-carrying voice, rang through the silent street. It was a child's simple, honest observation, a truth stripped of all malice. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the echo of her words. Then, a low murmur rippled through the crowd. A man near the saloon door repeated the phrase from the day before, but this time it was a verdict, a collective judgment. "Too fierce to wed," he said, and others nodded in agreement. May felt the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on her. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. She could feel their pity, their amusement, their contempt. She felt like an animal in a cage, being poked and prodded for their entertainment. She gently tried to detach the girl's hands, wanting only to disappear. Eli Cutter stood perfectly still. He was the center of the storm, the man whose daughters had just publicly claimed this outcast. Every person on that street was looking at him, waiting to see what he would do. They expected him to be embarrassed, to apologize, to scold his children and pull them away from the strange, large woman. He did none of those things. He looked past the staring faces, past the whispers and the smirks. He looked directly at May, at the profound pain and humiliation in her eyes. And in that moment, he made a choice. He was a man of few words, and he did not waste them now. "Do you need a place to stay?" he asked. The question was quiet, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap. It was not an offer of pity. It was a practical question, a lifeline thrown in a sea of scorn. May stared at him, her mind reeling. Part of her, the proud, wounded part, wanted to refuse. She did not want charity. She would not be a burden, another mouth to feed out of some sense of obligation for what had happened at the station. To accept his offer would be to admit defeat, to become dependent on the very kindness she had never learned to trust. But then she looked down at the two little girls still clinging to her, their faces filled with a fierce, protective loyalty. She looked back at Eli, at the quiet resolve in his eyes. It was not pity she saw there. It was something else, something she could not name. Fairness, perhaps, a simple human decency that refused to bow to the pressure of the crowd. He was offering her a choice when she thought she had none left. For the sake of the children, and for the unexpected glint of humanity in their father's eyes, she gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The ride to Coyote Bend was a journey into a different world. The wagon wheels crunched over the dry, rutted track, leaving the judgmental eyes of Gray Butte behind. The prairie opened up around them, a vast, silent expanse of sun-cured grass and hardy sagebrush, its clean, sharp scent filling the air. May sat on the wagon seat, a twin wedged in on either side of her, their small, warm bodies a surprising comfort. They chattered incessantly, pointing out prairie dogs and hawks, their questions a constant, bubbling stream. "Do you know how to make cookies?" June asked. "Can you braid my hair like a rope?" Josie wanted to know. May found herself answering them, her voice a little rough from disuse. And then, as June told a rambling story about a frog who lived in the water barrel, a smile touched May's lips. It was the first real smile in a long time, an unfamiliar stretching of muscles in her face. It felt strange and fragile, but real. The ranch house was a simple, sturdy structure of weathered wood, tucked into a bend of a dry creek bed and sheltered by a small grove of cottonwood trees. It was a place built for endurance, not for show. At the house, the agreement was made, as plain and solid as the wooden table they stood beside in the kitchen. "I can offer you a week," Eli said, his tone all business. "The old storage room off the back porch. It is not much, but it is dry. In return, I need someone to cook, to mend, and to keep an eye on the girls while I'm working the fence line. And meals," May added, her voice firm. It was crucial that this be a transaction, not a rescue. "And meals," he agreed, nodding. "After a week, we will see." It was enough. It was a start. That night, May lay on a narrow cot in the small storage room. It was clean, and a cool breeze whispered through the single window. She could hear the vast, deep silence of the prairie, a silence that was not empty but filled with the small sounds of the night. Her hip still ached, a reminder of the crate, but the sharper pain of her public humiliation had begun to fade, replaced by a weary sort of peace. Then she heard it, a sound drifting from the front porch, thin and lonely in the darkness. It was the sound of a mouth harp, playing a simple, melancholic tune. The notes rose and fell, weaving a story of a sorrow too deep for words. It was Eli. She pictured him out there in the pale moonlight, a solitary figure with his music. The sound was not polished or perfect, but it was honest. It was the voice of the quiet, wounded place inside him. Lying there in the dark, listening to the lonely music, May felt a strange kinship with a man she barely knew. They were two solitary people, each marked by loss, each surrounded by a silence of their own making. For the first time, she felt that perhaps, in this harsh and unforgiving land, she was not entirely alone. The kitchen at Coyote Bend had been a place of function, not comfort. It was a room Ellen had never had the strength to fully command, and in the months since her passing, it had become a space of male expediency. Utensils were misplaced, supplies were stored illogically, and a fine layer of dust coated everything that was not in daily use. May saw not neglect, but a deep and abiding sorrow. This was a room without a heart. She began before the sun was up, moving with a quiet efficiency that was second nature to her. She scrubbed the great cast-iron stove until it shone a dull, respectable black. She took inventory of the pantry, her mind a swift and silent calculator, portioning out the flour, beans, and salted meat, planning meals for the week that would be nourishing and waste nothing. The work settled her. The familiar rhythm of creating order from chaos a balm to her bruised spirit. By midday, a rich, savory aroma filled the small house, a smell it had not known for a very long time. It was a simple stew of beans and salt pork, simmered for hours with wild onions she had found near the creek bed. When Eli and the girls came in for their meal, the change was palpable. The room was warm, clean, and filled with the scent of home. He served the children, then himself, and sat at the head of the table. He ate in his usual silence, his gaze fixed on his plate. May busied herself at the stove, her back to him, her senses on high alert. She was waiting for a comment, a criticism, a sign of some kind. None came. He simply ate, his movements deliberate and steady. When he was finished, he pushed his chair back and stood. May glanced over. The plate was empty, wiped clean with a piece of bread. He gave her a single, brief nod before heading back outside. It was more than enough. It was a clean plate. It was acceptance. The next morning, the air was sharp with a chill that promised a day of blistering heat to follow. Eli was already at the corrals when May came out, a tin cup of coffee in her hand. He was wrestling with a roll of the new barbed wire, the metal fighting him like a living thing. "I can help," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her, then at her plain dress and apron. He started to shake his head, but she had already set her cup down and was rolling up her sleeves, revealing strong, capable forearms. She picked up a heavy mallet. "You hold it taut," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I will drive the staples." They worked through the morning, a silent, efficient team. Eli would stretch the vicious wire from one post to the next, his gloved hands pulling until the strands sang with tension. Then May, with a few powerful and precise swings of the mallet, would drive the U-shaped staples deep into the wooden post, securing the wire. It was brutal work. The barbs caught on her sleeves, tearing the fabric. They snagged her skin, leaving a series of angry red scratches on her hands and arms. She never flinched, never complained. Her rhythm was as steady as a heartbeat, her focus absolute. Eli watched her out of the corner of his eye. He had never known a woman who worked like this. She was not trying to prove anything. She was simply doing what needed to be done. There was a strength in her that had nothing to do with her size, a deep, quiet competence that he found himself admiring more than he would ever admit. The sun climbed higher, beating down on their backs, but they did not stop until an entire side of the main corral was secured. The first crack in the solemn quiet of the ranch came later that day, and it came in a cloud of white. May was in the kitchen, showing June and Josie how to knead dough for that evening's bread. Their small hands, clumsy and eager, were covered in flour. Giggles erupted as a dusting of white powder landed on Josie's nose. The giggle became a full-blown laugh when June, in a fit of playful mischief, tossed a small handful of flour at her sister. In moments, the air was thick with it. A fine white dust settled on every surface, on the girl's hair and clothes, turning them into miniature laughing ghosts. It was into this blizzard that Eli walked, his face grim with the news that a calf had gone missing. He opened the door and stopped dead, a shower of flour drifting down to land on his shoulders and hair. For a moment, he just stood there, his serious expression a stark contrast to the joyful chaos in the room. Then Josie, seeing him as the perfect new target, scooped up a double handful and flung it with all her might. It hit him square in the chest, exploding in a soft white puff. The girls froze, their laughter dying in their throats, their eyes wide with the sudden fear of having gone too far. May held her breath. Eli looked down at the flour on his shirt, then up at his daughter's terrified faces. A slow, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. A smile, a real one, touched the corners of his mouth. Then he let out a low chuckle. The sound broke the spell. The girls erupted in relieved giggles. May, watching him, felt a laugh bubble up inside her, a genuine, unburdened sound of pure amusement. Eli's eyes met hers across the flour-dusted air. He took a step toward her. He dipped 2 fingers into the sack of flour on the table and, with a surprising gentleness, reached out and drew a soft white line down her cheek. His touch was feather-light, the gesture simple and without consequence. Yet it sent a jolt through her. It was a moment of shared, unspoken connection, a silent acknowledgement of the laughter they had created together. The space between them hummed with a quiet intensity before he turned away to deal with the flour on his shirt. And the moment was gone. The world of Coyote Bend might have been one of flower storms and silent understanding, but the world of Gray Butte remained one of sharp words. Eli's former hired hand, Pete, a man let go for his laziness, found a willing audience for his grievances in the saloon. "She took my job," he grumbled into his beer. "That big woman just came in and took a man's rightful place. Silas Burke, who missed nothing, was there to fan the flames?" He laughed, a cold, unpleasant sound. "Well, Pete, you have to look at it from Cutter's point of view. A woman that size can probably do the work of 2 men, though I imagine it costs him twice as much to feed her." The men around the bar snickered, and another layer was added to the town's story about May O'Rourke. May heard the whispers when she accompanied Eli into town for supplies. She saw the sideways glances, the women who pulled their children a little closer as she passed. She did not engage. She did not defend herself. She held her head high and did her work. Her response was not in words, but in the neat stitches on the girls' mended dresses, in the rows of canned vegetables that began to fill the pantry shelves, in the quiet order of the ranch. At night, when the day's work was done, she would sit with June and Josie on the porch steps and tell them stories. She told them of the constellations, giving the stars names and histories, and of the great iron trains that crossed the country, weaving tales of adventure and faraway places until their eyelids grew heavy and they drifted off to sleep. One evening, after the girls were in bed, Eli came into the kitchen where May was wiping down the table. He placed a heavy ring of iron keys on the freshly cleaned wood. "These are for the hayloft and the smokehouse," he said, his voice low. He did not look at her. He turned and walked out before she could respond. May stood staring at the keys. They were cold and heavy in her palm. They were more than just metal. They were trust. He was giving her access to the heart of his livelihood, to the feed that kept his cattle alive and the meat that would see them through the winter. He was seeing her not as a temporary charity case, but as a partner in the running of his home. A fierce, protective joy rose in her chest, so sharp it almost hurt. She was being seen, truly seen, for what she could do, for who she was. But a cold fear followed close behind. The more indispensable she became here, the more she belonged, the more damage the town's ugly gossip could do. It was one thing for them to scorn her, A stranger. It was another thing entirely for their malice to splash onto Eli and his innocent daughters. The thought that her presence could bring them harm was a weight far heavier than any she had ever lifted. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. The earth was cracked and dry. The air grew heavy, and in the evenings, it carried the strange, metallic scent of ozone. The telegraph operator's warning had become a common topic of worried conversation in town. A dry storm. He had said, a storm with lightning but no rain, moving their way. A few days later, May felt a deep, forgotten longing. She watched Eli effortlessly swing up onto his horse and felt a pang of nostalgia for a time when she, too, had known that freedom. Her late husband had taught her to ride, but after his death, she had not had the heart for it. "I used to ride," she said, more to herself than to Eli. He heard her. He dismounted and looked at her thoughtfully. "There is the old mare. Daisy, she is gentle." He led the placid, sway-backed horse from the stable. May hesitated, the old insecurities rising. She was too big, too heavy. But the look on Eli's face was simply expectant, without a trace of judgment. She gathered her skirts and, with a surge of effort, pulled herself into the worn saddle. For a moment, the world tilted, but then she found her balance. The familiar feel of the horse beneath her, a welcome sensation. Eli did not hand her the reins. Instead, he took hold of the bridle himself. He began to walk, leading the mare in a slow circle around the yard. His hand on the leather was steady and sure. May could feel the gentle rhythm of the horse's gait, the solid presence of the man walking beside her. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a nervous, exhilarating rhythm that seemed to match the steady clopping of the horse's hooves on the hard, dry ground. The following Sunday, Eli hitched the wagon for church. It was an unspoken assumption that May would accompany them. The idea sent a wave of cold dread through her. The church was the town's heart, the place where its judgments were consecrated and given moral authority. To enter it was to face her accusers on their own holy ground, but to refuse would be seen as an admission of guilt, a confirmation of her unworthiness. And she could not bear to see the disappointment on the faces of June and Josie, who were already dressed in their mended Sunday best, their hair neatly braided. As she climbed onto the wagon seat, she felt the familiar shrinking sensation, a desire to be invisible that was at war with the simple fact of her own body. She sat ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon as they rode toward the steeple that pierced the vast blue sky. The moment they stepped inside, a hush fell over the assembled congregation. It was as if a cold draft had swept through the warm room. Every head turned, every eye was on her. May could feel the weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. She walked beside Eli down the narrow aisle, her steps measured and deliberate, her face a calm, unreadable mask. They sat in the Cutter family pew, a small island in a sea of hostile silence. The sermon was about the sin of pride, and May felt as if every word was a stone aimed directly at her. After the final hymn, as the congregation filed out into the bright sunlight, the minister's wife, a formidable woman named Martha Albright, positioned herself directly in their path. Her smile was thin and brittle. "Mr. Cutter," she said, her voice oozing a condescending sweetness, "it is good to see you and the dear children. And you have brought your housekeeper." She turned her sharp, bird-like gaze on May. "We have been so concerned. A woman of your circumstances living out at the ranch. One must be so careful of propriety. We are a town that values a woman's virtue above all else." The accusation was as clear as if she had shouted it. May felt a hot flush of anger rise in her cheeks, but she met the woman's gaze without flinching. She stood tall, her voice low but carrying in the sudden quiet. "I am here to work, Mrs. Albright," she said, her words simple and direct, "and to hope. I believe the Lord has room for both of those things in his house." A murmur went through the small crowd that had gathered to watch. Mrs. Albright, unaccustomed to being challenged, was momentarily speechless. Eli, who had stood silent and solid beside May, simply took each of his daughters by the hand and said, "It is time to go home." He did not acknowledge the minister's wife again. He had let May fight her own battle, and in doing so, had shown more respect for her strength than if he had spoken for her. Their victory, however small, was short-lived. As they reached their wagon, a figure stepped out from the shadow of the mercantile, blocking their path. It was Silas Burke, dressed in a black Sunday suit that seemed to absorb all the light around him. He was holding a piece of paper. "Cutter," he said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "A word." Eli's face hardened. "I have nothing to say to you, Burke." "Oh, I think you do," Silas said, holding up the paper. "I was just reviewing my ledgers. I have here a debt from last winter, for feed and grain, a substantial amount, taken out when your poor wife was so ill." He let the words hang in the air, a deliberate twisting of the knife of Eli's grief. "The interest has been compounding quite nicely. I find myself in a position where I must call it in. I will need payment in full by the end of the month, before the cattle drive." Eli stared at him, his jaw tight. "You know that is impossible. No one has cash before the drive." "A shame," Silas purred, though his eyes were cold and hard. "In that case, I will have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings on Coyote Bend. The law is the law. After all, we must maintain order." He glanced meaningfully at May, a sly, insinuating smile on his face. Eli stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the threat pressing down on him. Then, without a word, he lifted his daughters into the back of the wagon, helped May onto the seat, and drove away, leaving Silas Burke smiling on the street corner. The ride back to the ranch was silent and heavy. The threat of losing his home, the land his father had worked and died for, was a poison seeping into the air. That evening, Eli sat at the kitchen table, staring at his account book, the numbers a stark testament to his predicament. The only way to raise that much cash quickly would be to sell off his spring calves, the future of his herd. It would be a devastating blow, setting him back years. May watched him from across the room. His shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen before. She saw his pain, his pride, and his fierce, protective love for his children. And in that moment, an idea, born of desperation and her own quiet competence, took root. She wiped her hands on her apron and sat down opposite him. "Do not sell the calves," she said quietly. He looked up, his eyes weary. "What other choice do I have?" "There are 50 men working on the railroad spur a few miles from here," she said, her voice gaining strength. "They have to eat. The company food is terrible. We could make them better food. We could bake bread, make meat pies, put up jars of jam from the wild plums by the creek." Eli stared at her, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "You think flour, sugar, and a hot stove can beat that kind of heavy interest?" The question was laced with the bitter skepticism of a man with no hope left. May's chin lifted. "At least it can beat hunger," she replied. "And a hungry man with a few coins in his pocket is a good customer. It will not be much, but it will be something. Something is better than nothing." He was silent for a long time, studying her face in the lamplight. He saw no false promises there, only a steady resolve. He had nothing to lose. He gave a single, slow nod. The next day, the kitchen at Coyote Bend was transformed. The big stove was fired up from dawn until dusk, the air filled with the warm, yeasty smell of baking bread and the sweet, tangy scent of bubbling fruit. May worked with a focused energy, her hands moving with the confident grace of long practice. The first test of their new enterprise fell to June and Josie. May packed a basket with jars of gleaming plum jam and a dozen small, savory cornbread muffins. With a mixture of excitement and shyness, the two girls carried the basket into town, their father watching from a distance. They set up their store on a blanket near the mercantile. At first, people walked by, ignoring them, But the smell of the fresh cornbread was enticing, and the sight of the two little girls, their faces so earnest, was hard to resist. A blacksmith bought a muffin. A rancher's wife, curious about the jam, bought a small jar. By the end of the day, the basket was empty and their small coin purse was heavy. The small success was a tiny spark of light in a dark time. But a spark of light can attract moths. One of the railroad brides, a woman named Abigail, who had been courted and then rejected by the town storekeeper, saw May's growing presence in the Cutter household as a personal affront. May was everything Abigail was not: large, plain-spoken, and seemingly indifferent to the town's matrimonial market. Jealousy, sharp and bitter, took hold. She found her audience in Martha Albright. "It is a scandal," Abigail whispered to the preacher's wife over tea. "That woman has him wrapped around her little finger. I saw him myself, looking at her in a way a man should not look at his housekeeper. She is using those poor, motherless children to seduce him." The rumor, planted in such fertile ground, grew quickly. May felt the change in the air on her next trip into town. The whispers were louder, the stares more pointed and ugly. She heard a woman mutter the word seductress as she passed. It was a fresh wound, deeper and more painful than the others. That night, she waited until the children were asleep, then found Eli on the porch, staring out into the darkness. "I am ruining you," she said, her voice thick with misery. "My being here, it is bringing nothing but trouble and shame to you and your daughters. I should leave." Eli did not turn around. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the chirping of crickets in the dry grass. Then he spoke, his voice so low she had to lean closer to hear it. "You are not a burden here," he said. The words were simple, but they were solid. They were a foundation. He turned his head and looked at her, his eyes clear in the moonlight. "You are not a burden." A strange signal began to click over the telegraph wire in town, a frantic, irregular tapping that the operator could not decipher. The wind began to shift, blowing not from the west, but in strange, swirling gusts from the south, carrying with it the smell of distant dust and electricity. The sky took on a strange, yellowish tinge. Nature itself was adding its own layer of tension to the conflict brewing in Gray Butte. Under the cover of that strange, windy darkness, Silas Burke had a final, quiet meeting. He found Pete, Eli's disgraced former hand, nursing a cheap whiskey in the alley behind the saloon. Money was exchanged, a heavy clink of coins in the night. Silas's instructions were simple and cruel. "He thinks he is so clever with his new housekeeper," Silas hissed. "It is time he learned a lesson about what happens when you defy the order of things. I want you to ride out to Coyote Bend. Find the corner post of the main corral, the one nearest the open range. Loosen it, pull the staples, make it look like the wood has rotted. When the storm hits, the herd will do the rest." Pete, his loyalty bought for the price of a few silver dollars, nodded and slipped away into the night. An hour later, under a moonless, ominous sky, he was at the far corner of the Coyote Bend corral. With a crowbar, he pried at the base of the heavy wooden post, working it back and forth in the dry, hard ground. He pulled the staples that held the barbed wire, their screeching protest lost in the rising howl of the wind. He left the post standing, but it was a phantom, a trap waiting to be sprung. The seed of disaster had been sown. The sky had been a strange color all day, a bruised yellow-gray that muted the normally harsh sunlight. The wind, which had been a restless, swirling force, died down into an unnerving stillness. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on May's arms stand on end. Even the cattle in the corral were restless, their lowing carrying a note of anxiety. The first strike of lightning came without warning and without rain. It was not a distant flicker, but a violent, tearing slash of white-hot light that struck the low hills to the south. It was followed by a clap of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. May, who was on the porch shaking out a rug, saw a puff of smoke rise from the dry grass where the bolt had struck. For a moment, it was just a wisp. But then the restless wind returned with a vengeance, and the wisp exploded into a hungry wall of orange flame. Eli May's voice was a shout, sharp with alarm. He was already moving, running from the barn toward the house. The wind has shifted. It is coming straight for us. The prairie fire moved with a terrifying speed, a roaring beast consuming the tinder-dry landscape. The smoke billowed into the sky, turning the sickly yellow air to a churning, hellish black. The cattle, smelling the smoke and panicked by the rolling thunder, began to surge against the corral fences. They were a single, terrified organism, a mass of muscle and fear, moving without thought, driven by pure instinct. Then came the sound May would never forget, the sharp, sickening crack of splintering wood. Under the immense pressure of the surging herd, the corner post that Pete had sabotaged gave way. The barbed wire sprang loose with a vicious snap, and the side of the corral collapsed. The herd, their only barrier gone, was on the verge of a full-blown stampede, ready to pour out onto the open range and into the path of the oncoming fire, trampling anything and everything in their way. There was no time for thought, only for action. Eli sprinted for his horse, shouting over his shoulder, "Get the girls in the root cellar." But May saw that there was no time. The herd was already beginning to move. Her mind, sharpened by a lifetime of practical necessity, saw the problem not as a single disaster, but as a series of movements that had to be countered. She remembered things her husband, the blacksmith, had told her about the logic of herding, about creating a focal point, a voice of authority in the chaos. She ignored the root cellar. Instead, she ran toward the chaos. She scrambled up the side of the long, high feeding trough that ran along the intact side of the corral, her heavy skirts catching on the rough wood. From this vantage point, she was above the sea of panicked, rolling backs. She untied her thick wool shawl and began to wave it, a large, dark flag in the swirling smoke. "Hey-ya-ho, cattle, ho!" Her voice was not a scream, but a deep, powerful call from her diaphragm, a sound meant to carry over the noise of a forge. It was a sound of command, and a few of the nearest animals, their ears twitching, turned their heads toward the unexpected noise. Eli was mounted now, a coiled lariat in his hand. He was a master horseman, his body and the animal moving as one. He plunged into the edge of the herd, his own voice joining May's, trying to turn the leaders, to force the panicked flow back into the relative safety of the broken corral. It was then that the true horror of the situation revealed itself. The back door of the house flew open and two small figures, June and Josie, ran out into the yard. A young colt, terrified by the thunder, had bolted from its small pen, and the girls, their hearts filled with a pure, childish terror for the animal's safety, were running after it. Their path took them directly into the yard, into the open space where the panicked herd was beginning to spill. No, Eli's roar was one of pure anguish. A large steer, its eyes white with terror, broke from the main herd. It saw the small, running figures and lowered its head, its long, sharp horns pointing forward. It was not malice, it was blind, stampeding panic. May saw it happen. She saw the steer, she saw the girls, and she saw the dozen feet of open ground between them. In that instant, she was no longer a housekeeper, no longer an outcast. She was a shield. She leaped from the trough, landing hard on the dusty ground, the impact jarring her to the bone. She snatched up a heavy, loose plank of wood that had been part of the broken fence, with a guttural cry that was part fury and part prayer. She ran and threw herself between the charging animal and the children. She planted her feet, braced the plank against her hip, and met the charge. The impact was titanic. The steer's horns slammed into the wood, the shock vibrating up her arms and through her entire body. The plank cracked, splinters flying. The raw, brute force of the animal drove her backward, her boots skidding in the dirt, but she did not fall. She held her ground, a human wall against a ton of blind terror. In that same moment, Eli, with a skill born of desperation, reined his horse so hard the animal reared. He brought it down and sideways, slamming the horse's powerful shoulder into the steer's flank. The glancing blow, combined with May's unyielding resistance, was enough. The steer was thrown off balance. It stumbled, its charge deflected, and thundered past them, rejoining the chaotic flow of the herd. May staggered, her arms trembling, the broken plank falling from her nerveless fingers. Josie and June were crying, clinging to her skirts. There was no time to comfort them. The herd was still a roaring river of hooves and horns. But in the chaos, May's mind was startlingly clear. She saw the new sturdy fence of barbed wire that she and Eli had just built. It formed a long, narrow lane between the corral and the open pasture. It was a channel, a solution. "Eli!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the din. The lane drive them into the new fence line, funnel them through. He was across the yard, fighting to turn a different part of the herd. He heard her. He looked at her, then at the fence line she was pointing to. He did not hesitate. He did not question her. In that moment of supreme crisis, he trusted her judgment completely. "Go!" he yelled, wheeling his horse around. "Go now!" They worked together, a frantic, desperate, but perfectly coordinated team. May grabbed the girls, shoving them toward the relative safety of the porch, then ran back to the opening. Eli, with his horse and his rope, worked the edges of the herd, pushing, turning, and hazing them toward the narrow opening of the barbed wire lane. May, on the ground, flapped her shawl and shouted, her presence a steady, directing force, preventing the animals from doubling back. They funneled the terrified, bawling river of cattle into the narrow, secure channel, where they could run themselves out without scattering into the fire. It was then that the sky broke. The first drop of rain was as big as a coin, hitting the dusty ground with a small puff, then another and another. Within seconds, the heavens opened, and a torrential downpour began. It was not a gentle rain, but a driving, blinding sheet of water that hissed as it hit the leading edge of the fire, sending up great clouds of steam. It soaked them to the skin in an instant, plastered their hair to their faces, and turned the dusty yard into a sea of mud. The fire, which had been an unstoppable monster moments before, sizzled, smoked, and died. The chaos subsided, replaced by the drumming of the rain and the low, exhausted bawling of the contained herd. May stood in the middle of the yard, soaked, trembling, covered in mud and soot. June and Josie were huddled on the porch, crying. Eli swung down from his horse, his face a mask of grime and rainwater. He walked slowly toward her, his boots squelching in the mud. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the exhaustion and the raw emotion in his eyes. The anger he felt toward Silas Burke was a cold fire in his gut, but it was overshadowed by something else, something overwhelming. His voice, when he spoke, was a hoarse, ragged whisper. "Here," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "At this place, you just saved all of us." The words, so simple, so direct, broke something deep inside May. The wall she had kept around her heart for years, the wall built of shame and fear and the need to always be strong, finally crumbled. A violent shudder racked her entire body. A sound escaped her lips, a strange, choked noise that was half a laugh and half a sob. Then the tears came, hot and unstoppable, mingling with the cold rain on her cheeks. She stood in the downpour and wept, not for sorrow, but for the shattering, terrifying, and beautiful relief of finally, truly, being seen. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and ozone. At Coyote Bend, the work of recovery began immediately. The herd was safe. The fire was out. But the broken corral stood as a stark reminder of how close they had come to utter ruin. Eli found the sabotaged post that morning. The wood around the base splintered not from pressure, but from the prying of a tool. He found the holes where the staples had been ripped out. He said nothing, but a cold, hard anger settled deep within him. An anger that had a name and a face. In Gray Butte, Silas Burke moved to press his advantage. The chaos of the fire and the near stampede was a perfect smokescreen for his own brand of wickedness. He saw not a community that had narrowly averted disaster, but an opportunity to tighten his grip. He began his campaign in the saloon, buying drinks for men whose own fences had been damaged. A terrible business, he said, shaking his head with false sympathy. It is a sign of the times. When a man like Cutter allows his household to fall into disarray, when he brings in a disruptive element, the whole community suffers. That woman is a force of nature, but not a godly one. Too wild, too fierce to be a proper woman. It is no wonder the heavens sent a sign of their displeasure. The poison spread quickly, from the saloon to the mercantile, from the blacksmith's shop to the sewing circles. The story of May's heroism was twisted into something unnatural and dangerous. She had not saved the herd. She had mesmerized it with some strange power. She had not stood up to a steer. She had shown a shocking and unfeminine aggression. The label he had chosen for her became a catchphrase, a dismissal of her character in 4 simple words too fierce to wed. He made his next move in the harsh light of midday. Riding out to Coyote Bend himself, he found Eli reinforcing the broken corral. "Cutter," he called out, not dismounting, "I trust you have had time to consider my generous offer. The debt is due. Given the recent unpleasantness, I find my patience wearing thin. I will have the money, or I will have the deed." Before Eli could answer, Silas's gaze shifted to May, who was carrying a bucket of water from the pump. "It is a shame," Silas said, his voice loud enough for her to hear. "A man brings a whirlwind into his home. He should not be surprised when he reaps the storm." That Sunday, the atmosphere in the church was not one of quiet contemplation, but of charged anticipation. After the service, the minister, Reverend Albright, announced that the church council would be holding an immediate and urgent meeting. He requested that Eli Cutter remain. It was not a request. It was a summons. The council met in the church hall, a small, stuffy room that smelled of old hymnals and beeswax. The minister sat at the head of a long table, his wife at his side. Silas Burke was there, his expression one of pious concern. A few other town elders, men whose loans Silas held, filled the other chairs. May and the girls waited outside on the church steps. Reverend Albright cleared his throat. "Eli," he began, his voice heavy with practiced gravity, "we are all concerned, deeply concerned. There are whispers, rumors about the situation at your ranch, about the woman you are housing." "Her name is May O'Rourke," Eli said, his voice flat and hard as stone. "Yes, well," the minister continued, flustered, "Miss O'Rourke. It is an unorthodox arrangement. You must admit, for the sake of your dear, motherless children, for the sake of the town's moral standing, we feel this arrangement cannot continue. You must ask her to leave." Martha Albright leaned forward. "The woman is a spectacle. Eli, she is far too aggressive in her nature. It is not a suitable influence for young girls. People are saying she is too fierce, that she lacks the gentle spirit required by Scripture." Eli looked from one face to the next, at the self-satisfied piety, the feigned concern, the cold judgment. He was not a man of many words, but the words he chose were as solid and real as fence posts. He stood up slowly, his tall frame seeming to fill the small room. "Let me tell you about May O'Rourke," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. He pointed a finger at Silas Burke. "She started by saving my daughter from being crushed by a crate your man dropped at the station. Then, during the fire, she saved both my daughters from being trampled by a steer. She stood her ground with a piece of wood and turned it aside." He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping the table. She saved my herd, my entire livelihood. While this town was whispering, she was working. She had the sense to use the new fence line to contain the stampede. And when your man," he glared at Silas again, "demanded a debt I could not pay, she did not despair. She started a business from my kitchen. She baked and she canned, and she worked until her hands were raw to earn the money to pay you, coin by coin." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You talk about a gentle spirit. I have seen her gentle spirit with my children. You talk about scripture. I have seen her live it. She has been a better neighbor to me in 3 weeks than this council has been in a lifetime. She is not leaving." As he finished, the door to the hall opened. May stood there. She had heard everything. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a clear, steady light. She walked to the table, her movements calm and deliberate. First, she placed a small, neat stack of paper on the polished wood. "These are the receipts," she said, her voice clear and strong. "From the sale of bread and jam and muffins, there are $6.40 there. It is a beginning." Then, from the pocket of her apron, she drew a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside were 3 U-shaped fence staples, rusted and bent, their points blunted. "And these," she said, "are from the corner post of the corral that gave way. They were not broken. They were pulled, ripped from the wood with a tool." She looked directly at Silas Burke. That fire was no act of God. It was an act of a man. A collective gasp went through the room. Silas Burke's face went white, then mottled with red. "This is an outrage, an accusation from a desperate, fallen woman." His blustering was cut short by a small, shuffling sound from the back of the room. Pete, Eli's former hired hand, had been brought to the meeting as one of the concerned citizens. He had been trying to make himself small, to disappear into the woodwork. But now, every eye was on him. June, who had slipped into the room behind May, walked right up to him. She looked up at his face, her own filled with a child's simple, unwavering honesty. "Was it you, Mr. Pete?" she asked, her voice small but clear as a bell. "Did you pull the nails out of our fence?" The question, so direct, so innocent, shattered him. He looked from June's face to Eli's cold fury, to May's steady gaze. The weight of his guilt, of his cheap betrayal, was too much to bear. His face crumpled. A great shuddering sob escaped him, and he sank onto a bench, his head in his hands. "He made me do it." He wept, his words muffled and thick with tears. "Silas, he paid me $20, said it was time Cutter learned a lesson. I did not mean for anyone to get hurt. I swear it." The confession hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. Silas Burke leaped to his feet, his face a mask of pure fury. Lies all of it, the ravings of a drunk and a harlot. But his power in the room had vanished. His web of intimidation had been torn apart by a handful of rusted metal and a child's question. Reverend Albright, his face pale and his authority in tatters, finally did what he should have done in the first place. "Silas," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I believe we must ask the sheriff to join us." The tension in the room broke, not with a shout, but with a series of small, human gestures. One of the women on the council, who had been a harsh critic, walked over to May and touched her arm. "I am sorry," she whispered. "We were wrong." The fabric merchant, a man who had watched the whole proceeding in silence, spoke up. "Miss O'Rourke," he said gruffly, "I have a bolt of blue calico at the store, a good, sturdy cloth. It would make fine dresses for the little ones. It is yours. No charge." The chill that had filled the room began to recute. It was then that Josie, who had been hiding behind May's skirts, peeked out. She whispered something to May, a stage whisper that was perfectly audible to everyone in the quiet room. "I do not want to get married," she declared with the solemn finality of a 5-year-old. "I just want Miss May to stay in the kitchen and make muffins." A ripple of surprised laughter went through the room. It was a clean, healing sound that washed away the last of the bitterness. The icy judgment had melted, replaced by the simple, warm truth of a child's love for a woman who made good muffins. Silas Burke, seeing the tide had turned irrevocably against him, pushed his way out of the room. He paused at the door and turned back, his eyes burning with a cold, hateful promise. "This is not over! Cutter!" he snarled. "Wait until the cattle drive. You will see." The door slammed shut behind him. The threat lingered, a dark cloud on the horizon. The larger conflict was not resolved, but the balance of power in Grey Butte had shifted, not with money or influence, but with truth, courage, and a handful of rusty fence staples. In the aftermath of the storm, both natural and social, a quiet peace settled over Coyote Bend. The days fell into a rhythm dictated not by crisis, but by the steady, comforting cycles of work and life. The kitchen became the undisputed heart of the home, a warm, fragrant sanctuary that smelled of cinnamon, yeast, and simmering fruit. May, with June and Josie as her devoted and often flour-dusted apprentices, taught them the magic of turning simple apples and dough into bubbling, golden brown pies. Their laughter was a constant, bright melody in the small house, a sound that began to smooth over the rough edges of Eli's grief. Outside, the rhythmic sound of a hammer became the house's heartbeat. Eli, in his spare moments, worked on the porch, replacing a rotten board here, tightening a loose railing there. It was as if he were physically mending his home, shoring it up against the memory of past sorrows and the threat of future ones. One afternoon, he came back from the cottonwood grove dragging 2 long, smooth lengths of wood and a coil of new rope. By evening, a sturdy swing hung from the thickest branch of the largest tree, a silent invitation to his daughters, the sight of them soaring into the twilight sky, their squeals of delight echoing in the clear air, brought a rare, unguarded smile to his face. Life was measured in these small acts of creation and repair. The world of Grey Butte, with its sharp-edged judgments, seemed to recede, becoming a distant, hazy shoreline. Here at the ranch, there was only the work, the land, and the quiet, growing space between 4 people who were becoming a family in all but name. One evening, as the last of the sun's fire bled from the western sky, a familiar scene unfolded. Eli sat on the top step of the newly repaired porch, his back against a post, playing his mouth harp. The tune was different tonight, less melancholic, with a quiet, hopeful cadence that seemed to speak of the calm that had settled over them. Inside, in the soft glow of the kerosene lamp, May sat in a rocking chair, a basket of mending at her side. She was darning one of Eli's work shirts, her needle moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. The music flowed through the open doorway, a wordless conversation. May paused in her sewing, her hands still. She had been thinking about the woman in the mirror that morning, about the way her dress fit, about the space she took up in the world. The fear of judgment was an old, familiar ghost, and though it had been quiet lately, it had not vanished entirely. She spoke into the soft twilight, her voice so low it was almost part of the music. "I was always told," she began, her gaze fixed on the worn fabric in her lap, "that a woman should be delicate, that her size was a measure of her grace. I have never been delicate." Eli, he stopped playing. The sudden silence was more intimate than the music had been. He did not turn to look at her, but she knew he was listening, his attention absolute. "I have always been strong," she continued, the words coming slowly, each one a small, heavy stone she had carried for years. "And I have always been made to feel that my strength made me less of a woman, that it was something to be ashamed of." Eli was quiet for a long time. He looked out at the prairie, at the first stars beginning to prick the deep velvet of the sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, but imbued with a profound gentleness. "During the fire," he said, "I saw you stand your ground against that steer. I saw you hold a broken plank against all that blind fury to save my girls. Your strength, It held my whole world together in that moment. He turned his head then, and his clear, honest eyes met hers through the lamplight. That is what beautiful is. May, that is what it has always been. The simple, unadorned truth of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever spoken of her body, of her very substance, in that way. Not as a burden, not as a flaw, but as a source of beauty, a vessel of admirable power. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so new and overwhelming she did not have a name for it. From the darkened corner of the porch, just beyond the open door, a pair of tiny, conspiratorial whispers disturbed the charged silence. "Daddy's ears are all red," Josie hissed. "He is going to get mushy," June whispered back with grave certainty. A soft chuckle escaped Eli, breaking the spell. The redness on his ears deepened. May found herself smiling, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. The moment of profound intimacy had been broken, but it had been replaced by the gentle, grounding humor of the family they were building. The next evening, that partnership took a more practical form. The kitchen table was cleared of dishes and became a desk. Eli brought out his ledger, and May brought out the small tin box where she kept the money from her sales. They sat opposite each other, the lamp between them casting their shadows long on the wall. "We need a plan," Eli said, his voice all business. "Silas Burke will not forget. We need to know exactly where we stand." Together, they went over the numbers. The cost of flour and sugar, the price of jars, the income from each muffin and pie. May, with her neat, clear handwriting, started a new page in the ledger, titling it Kitchen Enterprise. She listed expenses on one side, income on the other. Eli watched her, a look of deep respect on his face. This was not a man giving orders to his housekeeper. This was a man consulting his partner. They agreed to split any profits, half to go directly toward the debt, the other half to be May's, a wage she had more than earned. She was not a shadow in his kitchen. She was an architect of their survival. As they worked, the comfortable silence allowed for deeper truths to surface. Eli paused, his finger tracing the entry from the previous winter, the one Silas had taunted him with. "Helen," he said, the name a soft, painful sound in the quiet room. "She was so sick. The fever took her so fast. I bought all that feed on credit thinking if I could just keep the herd strong, we would make it through. I spent so much time worrying about the cattle. I feel like—" His voice trailed off, thick with an old, ragged guilt. "I feel like I should have been able to save her, like I was not there enough." May reached a hand across the table and laid it gently on his arm. "You were trying to save her world. Eli," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you were fighting the winter for her, for your girls. You survived, and surviving is not a betrayal of memory. It is the only way we have to honor it." He looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He gave a slow, grateful nod. He had carried that burden alone for so long, and now someone was helping him set it down. The town, for its part, was slowly beginning its own journey toward redemption. The story of Pete's confession and Silas's treachery had spread like wildfire. People who had once whispered about May now spoke of her with a grudging and then a genuine respect. It became a regular sight to see a wagon from a neighboring ranch pull up to Coyote Bend, the driver looking to buy a loaf of maize bread or a few jars of her jam. The money was still in coins and small bills, but the tin box was growing heavier. At the town market, fewer people lined up at the stall supplied by Silas Burke's store. His influence, built on fear and obligation, was beginning to erode in the face of a better-tasting muffin. As the ranch's small measure of prosperity grew, so did the threat from the wild. Wolves, drawn by the scent of the calves, grew bolder, their howls a nightly chorus on the edges of the property. One afternoon, Eli brought out a heavy Winchester rifle. "You need to know how to use this," he said to May, "in case I am out on the range and you need to scare something off." He took her out to the edge of the pasture and set up a tin can on a fence post. The rifle was heavy and awkward in her hands. Her first shot went wide, kicking up a cloud of dust a yard to the left of the can. She was frustrated, embarrassed by her clumsiness. Eli stepped up behind her, his presence solid and calming. He did not touch her, but he spoke in a low, steady voice. "Brace it against your shoulder. Do not fight it. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." He watched her try again. The shot was closer, but still a miss. She let out a sigh of frustration. A slow smile touched his lips. "Do not worry about hitting the can," he said, a teasing glint in his eye. "A wolf does not care if you are a good shot. It only cares that you are not afraid. You do not have to shoot well, May. You just have to stand your ground." The words echoed his earlier compliment. It was not about perfection. It was about courage. She took a deep breath, braced herself, and fired again. The can jumped into the air and clattered to the ground. She looked back at him, a surprised, triumphant smile on her face. It was later that week, after a particularly successful day when a rancher had bought their entire stock of dried beef, that the final shift happened within her. The feeling of being a temporary guest, of living on borrowed time, had quietly dissolved. The little room off the porch was no longer a refuge. It was her room. The kitchen was not just a workplace. It was her kitchen. Coyote Bend was not a place to stay. It was home. Eli came in from the barn, his face tired but pleased with the day's sale. He looked at May, at the quiet competence and peace that now radiated from her. "Thank you, May," he said, his voice filled with a simple, profound gratitude. "I do not know what we would have done without you." And for the first time, when he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her in a brief, awkward, but deeply sincere hug, she did not stiffen. She did not pull away. She allowed herself to lean into it, to accept the comfort and the truth of the gesture. She belonged. The future, however, was about to arrive on an iron horse. The next time Eli went to town, he saw a notice pinned to the board outside the post office. The Union Pacific Railroad was expanding its repair depot and was seeking bids for a permanent contract to supply meals to its work crews. It was a massive undertaking, one that could provide a steady, reliable income far beyond what their small kitchen enterprise could ever hope to achieve. It was their chance, a chance to pay Silas Burke in full, to secure their future, and to finally, truly be free. The railroad notice was a simple sheet of paper tacked to a board and already ruffled by the wind. But to May and Eli, it represented a continental shift in their fortunes. The Union Pacific was a force of nature in itself, a river of iron and commerce that could sweep them out of the shallows of debt and into a current of stability they had only dreamed of. The contract to supply its work crews was not just a job, it was a kingdom. They spent 2 full days at the kitchen table, which had once again transformed from a place of meals to a council of war. With a seriousness that bordered on reverence, they planned and calculated. May, drawing on a deep well of experience, created menus that were both hearty and economical. She knew how many beans 100 hungry men could eat, how many loaves of bread would be needed, how to stretch a side of beef into a week's worth of nourishing stews and savory pies. Eli, with his rancher's practical knowledge, calculated the cost of supplies, the logistics of transport, and the number of smoked hams they could cure. Their proposal was not a hopeful guess. It was a meticulously constructed business plan, written out in May's clear, steady hand. When they rode into town to submit it at the telegraph office, which was also the designated receiving point, they felt a nervous pride. They had done good work. Their bid was honest, fair, and backed by a genuine ability to deliver. They saw Silas Burke there, submitting his own envelope. He gave them a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, a predator's smile. The next day, the bids were made public. Silas, using his bulk purchasing power from the slaughterhouse and the mercantile, had submitted a price that was impossibly low. It was not a business proposal. It was a declaration of war, an attempt to bleed them dry and bankrupt them through sheer financial force. When the number was read aloud, a hush fell over the small crowd. It was a killing price. Eli and May stood side by side. The news of physical blow. There was no way to compete. Their careful calculations, their honest work. It all meant nothing in the face of Silas's brutal, predatory numbers. A wave of despair, cold and bleak, washed over May. She had allowed herself to hope, and the hope had made this defeat all the more bitter. It seemed that in the world of men and money, a good stew would always lose to a sharp ledger. They rode back to the ranch in a heavy, defeated silence. The future, which had seemed so bright and full of possibility just a day before, had once again narrowed to a single, dark point: the impending due date of Silas's loan. The turning point arrived 2 days later, not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet arrival of the mail carrier. He had a single, unexpected letter for May. The envelope was of fine quality. The return address that of the convent in Cheyenne. Her heart beat a little faster as she opened it. Inside was not one letter, but two. The first was her original letter of introduction, the one she had carried like a talisman. The second was a fresh note, written in the Mother Superior's elegant, confident script. The letter was brief and direct. She had heard, through a letter from a former resident now living near Gray Butte, of May's troubles and of her quiet heroism by a stroke of providence. She wrote, the railroad's regional inspector, a Mr. Alistair Finch, was a man she knew well. His family had been benefactors of the convent for years. She had taken the great liberty of forwarding a copy of May's reference directly to Mr. Finch's office in Omaha, along with a personal note vouching for May's unimpeachable character and her extraordinary skill in managing the convent's orphanage kitchen, a kitchen that had fed 120 souls 3 times a day, on a budget that would have made a banker weep. May read the letter twice, her hands trembling. It was not just a reference. It was a key, delivered by the hand of grace, to a door she did not even know existed. The very next afternoon, a smart black carriage, a rare sight in Gray Butte, pulled into the yard at Coyote Bend. A man in a tailored city suit and polished boots stepped out, his expression crisp and impatient. He looked at the simple ranch house with the critical eye of a man who was used to judging things quickly and accurately. I am Alistair Finch, of the Union Pacific Railroad, he announced to Eli, who had come out to meet him. I am here to inspect a potential victualling operation run by a Miss May O'Rourke. May, wiping her hands on her apron, stepped out onto the porch. She was not flustered. She was a woman in her own kitchen, and she would meet this man on her own terms. I am May O'Rourke, she said calmly. You have arrived just as the bread is coming out of the oven. Mr. Finch, will you have a slice? For the next hour, Finch conducted his surprise inspection. He saw not a simple farmhouse kitchen, but a highly efficient operation. He saw the large, well-tended garden that supplied the vegetables, the smokehouse full of curing hams, the cool, organized pantry with its neat rows of canned goods. He saw the direct, unbroken line from the land to the table, a model of self-sufficiency and quality control. May answered his sharp, practical questions with quiet, knowledgeable confidence. Finally, she served him a bowl of the same simple beef stew she had made for the family, along with a thick slice of the warm, fresh bread. He ate in silence, his expression unreadable. He was not just tasting food, he was evaluating a supply chain, and he was deeply impressed. Just as he was finishing, a horse thundered into the yard. It was Silas Burke, his face flushed with anger and panic. He had clearly heard of the inspector's visit and had ridden out to intercept him. He dismounted and strode toward the porch, ignoring Eli completely. "Mr. Finch," he boomed, his voice dripping with false concern. "I am Silas Burke, a pillar of this community. I feel it is my civic duty to warn you. You cannot possibly consider giving this contract to this household. This woman's moral character is a matter of public scandal. Her virtue is openly questioned. She is not a fit person to be associated with a respectable company like the Union Pacific." He held up a small, crudely printed postcard, one of a batch he had clearly intended to circulate, which depicted a caricature of a large woman charming a man with a pie. It was a petty, vicious last-ditch effort. Alistair Finch placed his spoon deliberately in his empty bowl. He dabbed his lips with a napkin. He then rose to his feet and looked Silas Burke directly in the eye, his own gaze as cold and hard as railroad steel. "Mr. Burke," he said, his voice cutting and precise, "I am in the business of running a railroad. To do that, I require work crews, and to do their work, those crews require meals. I am therefore in the market for a head cook, not a town roomer." He gestured toward May. "Your bid," he said to Silas, "was a price for cheap food. Her proposal, and what I have seen here today, is a plan for a functioning kitchen. I prefer the kitchen." He turned to a stunned May and Eli. "The contract is yours. Miss O'Rourke, you will find a sizable advance payment authorized for you at the bank in Cheyenne, sufficient for you to acquire any necessary supplies. My office will be in touch with the details." The words hung in the air, momentous and unbelievable. The debt was gone. Their future was secure. Silas Burke stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and pure, undiluted fury. His financial power, his social influence, his web of slander had all been defeated by a bowl of good stew and a woman who simply stood her ground. That night, the rage in Silas's heart curdled into a final, desperate act of violence. Under the cloak of a moonless night, 3 men on horseback rode silently toward the ranch. They were men from the saloon, men whose loyalty Silas had purchased with whiskey and silver. They carried cans of kerosene and lit torches. At the ranch, a quiet celebration was underway. For the first time in a year, the little house felt light. The crushing weight of debt and fear lifted from its foundations. But as the household slept, a strange sound disturbed the peace. It was a low, hungry hissing, a crackle that was not the sound of crickets or the wind in the cottonwoods. May, a light sleeper by nature, sat bolt upright in her cot. Then she smelled it, the sharp, acrid scent of smoke. "Eli, fire!" she screamed, throwing on a robe and running into the main room. The storeroom, filled with their precious supply of flour and dried goods, was ablaze. Flames were already licking up the dry timber walls. But Eli and May did not panic. Their life was built on preparedness. The long water troughs for the cattle were full. In a frantic but coordinated effort, they grabbed buckets and began to fight the fire. They were a desperate, efficient team, their movements synchronized by the adrenaline of the moment. They were not just saving a building. They were saving the future they had just won. They managed to contain the blaze just as the main roof beams caught, dousing the last of the flames with the last of the water. In the smoky, wet aftermath, the sheriff, summoned by a neighbor who had seen the glow in the sky, arrived. It did not take him long to find the 3 sets of hoof prints, the discarded kerosene cans, and the clear trail leading away from the ranch. He and 2 deputies followed it. They caught the thugs before they had even made it back to town. Faced with the undeniable evidence and the grim face of the law, their drunken courage evaporated, and they confessed everything, naming Silas Burke as the man who had paid them to do it. The next morning, the sheriff walked into the mercantile and arrested Silas in front of a dozen stunned townspeople. The news of his final, cowardly act was the last straw. The people of Gray Butte, who had once been so quick to judge May, now saw the truth with perfect clarity. A petition was drawn up, a formal complaint against Silas, and nearly every adult in the town signed it. Silas Burke was taken to the county seat for a preliminary hearing. Faced with the signed testimony of his hired men and a petition from the very town he had sought to control, he was ruined. His slaughterhouse license was revoked, and he was hit with fines so heavy they would cripple him financially. The corrupt value system he had imposed on Gray Butte had been overturned. The social storm had finally passed. The last of the smoke cleared from the storeroom roof. revealing a bright, clear sky. The cattle drive was approaching. No longer a deadline for a debt, but the first great task of a new and unburdened life. The dawn that followed the resolution of Silas Burke's treachery felt like the first true morning of the year. A silver mist clung to the low places, making the Coyote Bend Ranch look as if it were floating on a soft, white sea. The air was cool and clean, washed by the storm and purified by the fire. The sun rose, not as a harsh accuser, but as a promise, turning the mist to gold and the dry grass to a deep, rich ochre. The cattle, secure in their mended corral, were a river of brown and red backs, moving with a placid, munching sound toward the feed troughs. Eli stood on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the light. He heard a sound, a rhythmic thump, 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 and a cascade of giggles. June and Josie were already in the yard, taking turns riding Peaches, their small, stubborn donkey. They waved at him, their face bright with the simple, uncomplicated joy of the morning. May came out to join him, bringing the coffee pot. She filled his cup, and then her own. They stood in the comfortable silence they had built, a silence that no longer needed to be filled with words. The scarred wood of the burned storeroom stood as a monument to what they had survived. Eli watched his daughters, his heart a tight, full ache in his chest. He set his coffee cup down on the railing. He turned to May, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "May," he said, his voice low. He led her to the other end of the porch, away from the open door where the girls might hear. He reached just inside the door and brought out 2 packages he had hidden there. He had ridden into town the day before, while she was organizing the kitchen, on a private mission. He handed her the first package. It was heavy, wrapped in brown paper. She opened it to find a pair of new leather work boots, sturdy and fine, made to last a lifetime. They were her size. The second package was softer. Inside was a heavy leather apron, the kind a blacksmith or a cook who meant business would wear. In the center, burned neatly into the hide, were 2 letters M.O. May looked at them, then at him, her eyes wide, unable to speak. "That room off the porch," Eli said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not hide. "It is not temporary. It has not been for a long time. This is your home, May, if you will have it." He fumbled in his pocket, his large, calloused hand clumsy. He pulled out a small, simple ring. It had been his mother's. He did not hold it out to her. He held it in his palm, as if offering a fragile, heavy truth. Then, in a move that was both awkward and profoundly graceful, Eli Cutter, a man who had never been comfortable with grand gestures, knelt on one knee on the weathered porch boards. He looked up at her, his gaze steady and stripped of all pretense. "I am not a man who has a lot of fancy words," he began, his voice thick. "But I know what I see. I see a woman who saved my children. I see a woman who saved my ranch. I see a woman who saved me." He took a deep, shaky breath. "I do not just want a partner for the railroad contract. May, I want a partner for all of it. I want to build this life with you. I want to raise my girls with you. I want to grow old with you, right here." He finally, haltingly, held up the ring. "May O'Rourke, will you marry me?" May stared at him, at this strong, quiet man kneeling before her, offering her the one thing she had never, ever allowed herself to dream of a place to belong. The tears that came were not the hot tears of shame or the ragged sobs of grief. They were quiet tears of profound, impossible joy. She could not find her voice. She could only nod, her entire body shaking with the force of her yes. At that exact moment, June and Josie, having abandoned their donkey, came running around the corner of the house. They skidded to a stop, their eyes round as saucers at the sight of their father on his knee and May crying. For a second, they were confused. Then, Josie's face split into a grin of pure, 5-year-old comprehension. She put her hands on her hips and shouted, in a voice that carried across the entire yard, the phrase that had once been May's shame and had become her badge of honor. She's fat but an angel, Daddy. June, not to be outdone, added the triumphant conclusion. And she is not too fierce to wed. Either see you caught her. The joyous, ridiculous proclamation broke the tension. Eli, still on one knee, let out a laugh that was half a sob. He stood up, and May met him halfway. He wrapped his arms around her, and she wrapped hers around him, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. It was a long, warm embrace, chaste but fiercely protective, a silent vow made in the morning sun. The girls immediately scrambled to join, wrapping their small arms around May's waist and Eli's legs, creating a tangled, laughing, weeping knot of a family. May, buried in the center of their warmth, finally felt the last of the old, cold fear dissolve. She was not just seen, she was chosen. The wedding was held the following Sunday. It was a simple affair. May wore a new dress of the blue calico the merchant had given her. Eli wore his Sunday suit, brushed and neat. The church was not filled with the cold. Judgmental eyes, May remembered. It was packed to the doors with the people of Gray Butte, who had come to bear witness to the union they had once tried to prevent. Reverend Albright, his face humbled, met them at the altar. His sermon was not about sin or propriety. It was about grace and the surprising, powerful ways it could manifest in the world. He spoke of courage, of loyalty, and of the scales falling from a town's eyes. He looked directly at May and Eli. "We, as a community," he said, his voice thick, "are grateful for the lesson you have taught us, a lesson in what a home truly is." After the service, the townspeople did not just offer handshakes. They brought gifts. They were not expensive things, but they were things that mattered. Sacks of seed for the garden, jars of honey, bolts of sturdy fabric, and so much food the tables in the churchyard groaned. The women who had once whispered about May now embraced her, offering her their family recipes for pie crust and pickles. The social order, once rigid and cruel, had been remade, reformed around a new center of gravity, the simple, undeniable goodness of the family at Coyote Bend. They had learned that a person's value was not measured by their appearance or by the whispers of a crowd, but by the steady strength of their character. And they had learned that a family was not always the one you were born into, but the one you chose and the one you fought for. Every single day, life fell into a new, brighter rhythm. The burned storeroom was rebuilt, bigger and more efficient, and it became the official supply kitchen for the Union Pacific. The contract, managed by May's sharp mind and Eli's practical strength, was a success. The advance payment had cleared the last of Silas Burke's debt, with plenty to spare. The kitchen became a landmark, a place known for its honesty and its quality. Eli, with the new stability, started a small side project he had always dreamed of. He began taking in orphan calves, the runts and the motherless ones that other ranchers left for the wolves. He and the girls would bottle feed them, and the orphan corral became a fixture at the ranch. Soon, children from town were riding out on Saturdays, not just for a slice of May's apple pie, but to help feed the calves, to learn how to bake bread at her side, to be a part of the warmth that radiated from the Coyote Bend kitchen. One evening, months later, May stood at her kitchen window. The first chill of autumn was in the air, but the house was warm. She watched the prairie, no longer a place of fear, but a vast, beautiful canvas, drenched in the deep gold of the setting sun. She could see June and Josie on the swing Eli had built, their legs pumping as they tried to touch the sky. From the porch, she heard the sound of Eli's mouth harp. It was not the lonely, grieving tune she had heard that first night. It was a melody, full and steady and content, a sound that spoke of a home built and a heart mended. She placed her hand on the windowsill, a quiet gratitude filling her. She thought to herself, in this land of wind and dust, in this hard, uncompromising country, love was not a delicate thing. It was the thing that kept you standing firm. Thank you for listening to the story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to support us and help this story be heard by more people.